Welcome to the Line podcast, recorded on August 22nd, 2024. Today, your co-hosts Jen Gerson and Matt Gurney are going to be discussing a new voice in the Senate. Charles Adler is appointed to the big house. We're going to talk about Jagmeet Singh and his challenge with community notes. And lastly, we're going to be doing a vibe check. That's it this week at the Line podcast. This episode of The Line has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Canada can be a global leader in reducing the harm caused by smoking, but it requires actionable steps, including giving adult smokers the information they need to choose potentially less harmful alternatives. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.
All right, confession time. We'll start right off the top of the confession. Jen already noted we've recorded this August 22nd. It's going to be published August 23rd. Family event, guys. One of us has to be on the road. The timing to do this tomorrow just didn't work. So what we've done is we've done this as late on Thursday as was feasible. But we're not going to lie. It probably everything we're going to talk about is probably going to be obsolete by tomorrow. Not because we're reckless, but because the news gods hate us sometimes. So we're going to do our best here, but I just really hope the news gods spare us a little bit.
Can I talk about why we're doing this a day late, and maybe our listeners will forgive us?
I was not going to reveal your personal info, but if you want to reveal that, you can.
All right. Well, let's make my husband twitch a little bit and confess that today is our 10-year wedding anniversary. Is that not, I'm horrified and also really, I got warm feelings in my chest about it all day. Both of us completely forgot it was today and we didn't get each other presents, but we did look at each other last night and look like, oh shit, our anniversary is tomorrow, isn't it? That's right. Yes, it is. No, we are going to be heading out of town with the kids and our in-laws to do a special little weekend getaway for our anniversary to celebrate. I'm thrilled, but also frankly deeply surprised that it's been 10 years because it feels like I married my husband maybe 3 years ago, maybe 4. And now all of a sudden I'm an old middle-aged woman with the aluminum anniversary under her belt, if you can believe it. So anyway, don't tell anybody that, or if you know my husband, tease him mercilessly about it because it will make him cringe inside that I've revealed personal information on a podcast.
See, I'm wired the same way he was. That's why I was vague. I said family event, one of us. I didn't even say it was you.
Yeah, no, totally.
I am wired to not reveal this stuff.
Yeah, but I really like to reveal these sorts of things because it makes me feel respectable, demure, cutesy.
Congratulations on a decade of matrimony.
Thank you very much. It's actually kind of cool. It's kind of cool.
I'm getting desperately awkward here. Can we get to the politics? Yeah.
Yep.
So this is only something I'm going to share for a laugh. You want to talk about a federal story at more length,
yes.
But I had a laugh at this. Jagmeet Singh, federal NDP leader. Give me a second. I'm going to click off our recording software here. I'm going to read this verbatim, okay?
Okay, sure.
So Jagmeet Singh, federal NDP leader, tweeted this week. Give me one moment. Justin Trudeau told Canadians things would be better. Instead, they've gotten worse. Families are losing their homes, landlords are making record profits, and rents have doubled. Our movement is going to take power away from greedy CEOs and give it back to people. So that's okay. That's kind of generally what you think it. That's what an NDP leader says. And the problem Mr. Singh has that you and I have talked about before is that Justin Trudeau might not be prime minister today if Jagmeet Singh had not decided to enter the supply and confidence agreement with him. Which means that the Liberals stay in power for a full term, effectively with majority powers, not quite, but almost, because of Mr. Singh. And what I love about this is that I've done this before. I'm sure you've done this before, but a billion other people have done this before. People will have funny tweets or memes or whatever when Jagmeet Singh talks tough on Justin Trudeau, his confidence and supply agreement partner. He got community noted. And for people who, God bless them, are not on Twitter, community notes are when sort of the Twitter hive mind flags a tweet as inaccurate and sort of crowdsources a correction.
Which are often very, very hilarious.
Let me click out of the recording software again. I'm just going to read this live here. This is the community note appended to Jagmeet Singh's tweet. Important context. Justin Trudeau is in government because of a confidence and supply agreement with Jagmeet Singh. By entering into this agreement, Mr. Singh is effectively propping up the government he's complaining about above. See, when you and I do snarky tweets about it, when we talk about it in the podcast, it's political punditry, it's commentary. When it's community note calling out the self-evident bullshit of Jagmeet Singh talking tough on the federal Liberals, I don't know, maybe I'm just broken inside. That to me was hilarious. And here's the thing. Everything that happens on Twitter, I'm going to use technical formal language here, okay? It's a fart in the wind. Everything that happens on Twitter is gone in a day. Like, we have such short memories and attention spans on this stuff. So is anyone going to care about the community note on Jagmeet Singh's tweet a week from now? No. But for right now, this moment, we can have a laugh at it because it's perfect. 10 out of 10, no notes. I love it. And I like to, every once in a while, it's such a dark podcast so much of the time because the tenor of all the tenor of the times, the challenges we're dealing with. This one is good for a laugh, and I offer it to the listeners and the viewers because I love them.
Also, I would just like to point out, I really love community notes. It's one of the best features to be introduced in Twitter in a really long time. And in part, the reason why I enjoy community notes so much is because they're very passive aggressive in a very Canadian way that really, really speaks to the darkness of the Canadian soul. So, no, they're always polite. They're neutrally worded, but like the implicit "fuck you" underneath it is always pretty glorious. So, looking forward to my first community note.
Like if 10,000 people reply to Singh going, "You're his partner," that's 10,000 tweets that algorithmically all get buried. A community note, everybody sees.
Yeah, that stays with you forever. So yeah, love that community note. Now, I want to talk about another little bit of chatter, scuttlebutt, news about Ottawa, so to speak. I'm going to talk like this for the rest of the podcast. No, Charles Adler, noted radio show host, kind of and political pundit himself, has been appointed to the Senate and part of the Justin Trudeau sort of fashioned independent Senate. Matt, how should I say this? I don't want to comment on Charles Adler personally or anything else. I don't. But I think that whenever you and I see journalists appointed to the Senate, regardless of our feelings about that journalist, you and I basically have the same reaction. You and I had the same reaction, for example, when Paula Simons was appointed to the Senate for Alberta. This despite the fact that Paula Simons, we both adore. I mean, I don't know, speak for you, but I mean, Paula Simons is probably one of my favorite people in the industry. And Paula Simons also, I think, has been a really good senator on the whole. Like, it's not to say that I've always agreed with every position that she's taken or whatever, but I mean, I've been on her podcast. I think she's very accessible. I think that she's very intelligent. I think she comes at issues with the right mindset. And I think that on the whole, her record as a senator has been really strong. That said, I have issues. Sorry, Paul. I have issues when journalists take these kinds of jobs, regardless of how much I might personally like them. And one of those issues is that I do think that it has the effect of bringing the entire reputation of journalism into disrepute. Because rather than presenting lifelong journalists as adversaries of people in power, which is our job is to be disliked. Our job is to be unlikable shitheads who get...
And we're great at it.
Whose name is spat in the halls of power. And I mean, we're supposed to be that regardless of who is in power, right? Instead, it makes it look like this is all one big game to us, and we're gamifying this system so that we can work our way up the social ladder to inevitably gain some kind of elite status or elite position within those very halls of power that we're supposed to be condemning. And just to be clear, I don't think that was Paula Simons' intent at all. I think that she had a long and established career in journalism that was very respectable and for a reason. I just think she was a really credible individual who's obviously made a good senator. But like, how does a reader respond when they see someone like Simons or Charles Adler, people who have like built an entire public reputation for themselves around being like this truth teller, straight talk, whatever, get co-opted into the very halls of power that they've been talking straight about for decades. I mean, as a reader or a listener, that would make me feel betrayed, because I feel like it would be a betrayal of the brand that they've built their entire status around. And it would make me look at Matt Gurney and Jen Gerson and say, well, what the fuck are you going to do when you get the call, dickheads?
Yep.
And I don't blame them for feeling that way. For what it's worth, I do feel that you and I are definitely far too unlikable to be ever considered for the Senate. I mean, I also can't totally rule out that some 70-year-old version of Jen Gerson will have lost her goddamn mind and would take that job. But I think it presents a real tension, and it presents a real challenge. And of course, Paula and Adler are not the only people. Pamela Wallen's also in the Senate as well. And again, I like Pamela Wallen very much. The one time I've had with her as a senator, I thought she offered really good questions and offered some really good points. But it's a really challenging thing for a journalist to be taken on. So that's sort of my global response to this. I have issues with it. My specific response to this is Adler's concern.
Can I request we put a pin on that? Can I respond to the global ones?
Yes,
and
let's
then we
respond
can move
to the
on
global
other
ones first. Yes.
It's just, other than that, it's just going to get out to be a hard conversation.
Sure.
Globally, I agree. I want to say, before we move to phase 2 of this conversation, Charles Adler is a friend of mine, and he and I have been friends and colleagues for a long time. We haven't talked as much lately, which might be partially explained by some of what you're going to get into in phase 2. But a much younger me was helped out tremendously in the early part of my career by Charles Adler. And I want the listeners and the viewers to know that. And I don't approach this story with completely neutral eyes. Charles was a huge help to me getting established early in my career. The fact that I'm a podcast host today, it's not a million miles removed from him and his CJOB studios in Winnipeg deciding to make me, on the phone, a regular contributor to the old Charles Adler show. So that's something I feel honor bound to put on the record here. And that's why I suspect you're going to do most of the talking in phase 2. But on the global issue, I agree. And there's been a few of these lately. And you and I spoke recently, at least not that long ago, about Sabrina Madoe, National Post columnist, who then announced that she was going to run as a conservative candidate. Eventually, she unannounced that, and she is not, but that's a separate conversation. But that gave you and I the opportunity to have a very similar conversation to this. The Senate is different. For Sabrina, she left a gig at the National Post, where she was a political columnist, to run for a nomination, a competitive process, which, if she had won, would have set her up to run in a general election, another competitive process,
where she would have to have earned the trust of her constituents to the degree twice. Yeah. I have some issue with that, but of all the types of jumping ship that journalists can do and do, like the industry's collapsing. A lot of journalists are having to find other career paths. That's just the reality that we're in. It's no longer a career path where people can spend their entire careers here for most of the cases. So like on the hierarchy of problems that I personally, Jen Gerson, I know everybody's taking notes here. On the hierarchy of problems that Jen Gerson has when people jump ship. The Gerson Scale. Like the bottom of this is journalists jumping ship to take jobs with not-for-profits or charitable enterprises or schools or things like that. That's like, okay, I've got no problem with that. You've just left the industry. You've moved on. That's life. That's cool. As long as there was no conflict prior to your reporting prior to that, or minimal conflict prior to that. Okay, whatever, that's life. Next up is people doing what Sabrina Madoe did, which was, okay, you've left your job as a newspaper columnist or reporter or whatever, and now you are going to submit your name for public service through a competitive process by which you will have to earn the trust of your party and also your constituents. Okay. I think that there might be some issues where if there's, for example, an overlap of editorial commentary, like, for example, there were some concerns with Sabrina that, like, well, how long were you thinking about this before you decided to jump ship? And were you easy on the conservatives? Was there an overlap period there? I think that that's a legitimate thing to criticize her for. But okay, fine.
Also, whether or not her editors knew, I don't
Whether or not her
know,
editors
but
knew,
that's another
100%.
issue.
So it's not like it's issue free, but it's closer there. Next up, I would say like journalists jumping ship into highly contentious GR or PR roles in the corporate sector. Now we're starting to get into some muckiness, but often muckiness that happens and is overlooked because it's outside the public sphere. Next up on top of that is taking Senate appointments. That's sort of second from the top. And top up on Jen Gerson's personal Maslow's scale of problematic career jumps for journalists is staff jobs, taking political staff jobs. Political staff jobs. So appointments, political staff jobs, highly paid positions where you're working in backrooms, so you haven't subjected yourself to a competitive process necessarily. You're being taken in part because of the profile that you've built on a brand, building trust within the public, and you're using that and abusing that to work the other side of the public manipulation game. So like that's my personal scale of like least to most icky from my point of view. But like that's,
I think, you know what, I would want to think about the Gurney scale before committing to it in a podcast stream of consciousness. But that to me sounds about right. Like I don't really think I've got any problems with that.
Well, which is not to say that I wouldn't necessarily take one of those jobs if I had to do it for the money. I mean, like nobody is perfectly ethical in all circumstances. I'm not above making, those types of choices. I've never had to take one of those choices in my career.
Pop culture reference. You're going to miss this one. Listeners, readers, I like to challenge you guys. Hey man, I got 5 kids to feed.
Yeah.
So we'll see how long it takes someone in the comments to
on that note,
that one.
Like, subscribe, and please pay our subscription fees. They're very reasonable, and also they keep us out of the Jen Gerson Maslow's hierarchy of problematic journalistic jumps.
Can I add to that though? Because while we're still on the global issue, before we move to phase 2, I agree, but I want to add something just to the conversation. 2 things in particular. First one's a quick point. Diplomatic postings.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah, I would add that to the hierarchy.
That's one that would be on the Gurney scale that I would probably put.
Second,
I'd put that one in
the Senate.
I think above Senate, below staff.
Okay.
That's where I would slide that one, and there have been a bunch of those lately.
Mm-hmm.
Problematic.
Mm-hmm.
The bigger point I want to make, but I'm going to speak beyond the audience here. This is directly aimed at our friends in the media who listen, and I know some of you do. Jen and I get how much this job sucks. And I know the broader audience might not want to hear us crying in our beer, and I'm not going to make this a woe is me segment here. But what I am going to say is, if you don't think that Jen and I, separately, to be clear, have lost sleep at night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking, is it too late to become a plumber? Should I go work for my dad?
Mm-hmm.
Do I go back to school and get a degree and become a nurse? Like, there have been so many nights I've had, and I have to imagine you've had the same thing, just like everybody else working in this industry, where at the end of a long day, the reward to bullshit ratio is just not great. And you've spent all day overworked, stressed out, people you've never met are screaming at you on the internet, and you are a highly educated, high social capital individual with an absolutely spectacular Rolodex, earning probably a third of what you would in a comparable PR or GR comms role. I get it. I have absolutely flirted with leaving this industry. I have had conversations. In one case, I was pretty close to signing to leave in a job that you don't get to come back from. Ultimately, I couldn't do it. I'm too hardwired to this. But like you said before, the question of auditioning, I am absolutely auditioning for other jobs in my work. If CBS wants to hire me to create the next Star Trek show, I'm in. I'm gone. And my columns will be shamelessly used against me. 100% I'm doing that. If Firaxis Games wants me on board the team for Civilization 8, yes. Jen, I am gone from this job like that. There are passion projects that could lure me away from this. And I think those passions come out of my column sometimes. Or if I don't play an instrument, but like if Rush wants to reform and they need me in the band, I'm in. I don't know how I'm going to contribute, but I would do that. But I think in general, all I'm saying to our colleagues in the industry who might right now be entertaining those offers, I don't judge you morally for this. I get it. And I also understand that a lot of us right now are look what we were talking about last week, right? Just last week, we were talking about an entire radio station being closed down. If any one of those people had taken some gig in the private sector, even if it was a little bit queasy, I'd get that. But I think what we have to understand, whether it's, you've mentioned Paula, you've mentioned Pamela, you've mentioned, obviously, Charles. We've talked about Sabrina. There are others who've made similar moves in recent years. Those are just the ones we've talked about right now. I'm not telling them not to do it. I'm not saying that they made the wrong decision for them or their families.
No, they're making the best decision for them in their lives. But those of us
who cost it imposes on the rest of us.
And there's a cost that it imposes on the rest of us. And that doesn't mean the answer is don't do it. It just means that those of us who are left behind on team can't work anywhere else kind of have the right to say, yeah, it's a little icky. Until we do it ourselves. Anyway, look, we're definitely not auditioning for Senate jobs is kind of the other point that I'm going to make here.
I don't know if this is a phase 1 or a phase 2 conversation. Maybe this is how we actually bridge one to the other. Well, first,
because there's one more point I want to make on the phase 1 conversation.
Sure.
And that is, we do need to get back as an industry to the idea of once you jump, you can't come back. That used to be a norm in our industry 10 years ago, that once you make the jump out, you're out. That was a norm and an expectation and a standard. And I think that.
How do you feel about cooling off period?
No, I think once you're gone, you're gone.
See, I'm a little more liberal.
I don't think that we can give our colleagues shit for making this jump and then welcome them back with open arms. Like I actually think that we need to set a standard where you can work in journalism until you can't work in journalism, and that's fine. You can make that call. But once you've taken the corporate PR job, I don't think that you should be allowed to come back.
I am less draconian than you on that, but I do think you should never bed jump between politics and journalism.
No, okay. So here's where I would have just said, if you've taken a job to go work at like a comm shop at U of T, okay, mm-hmm. Okay, cool. You can come back from that. If you've taken a job to I'm going to go do comms for Amnesty International and decide it's just not for me. Okay, that's fine. You can come back to that. But I think that once you've made the jump into the political sphere or into the really, really highly contentious corporate sphere, I think that that's probably a line that you shouldn't be jumping back into journalism from.
All right. My sense on that, and I understand what you mean, but I think if someone does take one of those jobs and then leaves that job and go and works for like a law firm or it does anything like meditates, whatever, for 5 or 10 years, and then they get a column in the local paper, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'd be fine with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, like there's because I think someone who has NGO experience, political experience, business experience, and journalism experience probably has things I want them to have a public platform to say. But no, I don't think, just as a hypothetical example, I don't think you could do like a Sabrina Mado. I don't think Sabrina Mado should be a National Post columnist again within the next 5 years. Okay,
or the other thing I would say is like, okay, so come back in what capacity would be the other question. I don't think that person should be coming back and doing general assignment news reporting or be a news reporter. That person might be able to come back as someone who is a columnist who is bringing a specific type of expertise to the subject matter. So say, for example, you've taken the high-powered corporate job at contentious corporation number X, and then you want to come back and you want to do some writing. Maybe you can write a column a week or a column a month or whatever from the perspective of someone who's worked at contentious place number X and have that be disclosable at the bottom of all your columns. Yeah, that's fine. I think that that's fine. But no, I don't think
I always appeal to your more reasonable side.
That's fair. But I mean,
bring
I
out
don't
the
think,
best in you.
but I don't think someone should be necessarily go from like political staffer to 2 years later, or even after cooling off period, political staffer to like becoming the editor in chief of a major newspaper.
Yeah, I agree.
Like that's not cool. Like that's not on. Anyway, that's a very global argument, and I know we've rambled on some, but I do want to get into the more specific phase two of like the specifics around Charles Adler in particular. Now, Charles Adler did a really interesting interview with Ryan Jesperson where he talked about a couple of things. And there's two things in particular where Charles Adler's appointment kind of does irk me a little bit. One is that Charles Adler has been very open about hating on the Senate and calling for a reform Senate, a triple E Senate, the triple E Senate. I'm just getting hung up here. I just had a brain fart. Matt, triple E Senate.
I can't remember either.
Elected equal. It's like accountable is the third point, but it's like it's elected equal, but there's another. Jesus Christ, I'm so sorry.
We're professionals.
We're professional political pundits. Triple E. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so embarrassed.
Man, are we ever impressed?
Oh my God. Equal, effective. There we go. Equal, elected, and effective. There we go. I do that. Anyway.
I was equal. I could come up with equal elected, but I was like you. I was going to accountable, not effective. And I knew that was wrong.
Yeah, I know. So anyway, so Jesperson, to his total credit, starts pulling out Adler's own quotes.
By the way, Charles has been a regular partner with Jesperson on Ryan's show.
So, and Jesperson, to his total credit, is sitting there pulling out Charles's old quotes on the Senate about how Adler was calling for a triple E Senate. And of course, Adler has not been elected to the Senate here. He's been appointed. And I found Adler's response to that to be both sanctimonious and hypocritical, if I can be blunt.
You can be blunt. I haven't seen the interview. I'm going to go watch it.
Yeah, so you should go watch it. You should go watch it. So basically, his response is, well, I can only be in the Senate for 5 years because I'm 75 in 5 years. But in that time, I'll be working from within to try and reform the Senate to a triple E Senate. And he starts talking about the triple E Senate, and I'm going like, I don't believe you. I don't believe that you are going to make any significant strides toward an elected Senate in the next 5 years. I don't think that is plausible. I don't think that is realistic. And worse, Kate, and actually to be perfectly blunt, I don't think that Charles Adler seriously believes that is a realistic or plausible answer. So the whole, yes, I've criticized the Senate, but when they came McCollin, I took the position and ran with it, because I can reform it from the inside and get it to be more in alignment with my critiques from the inside. I don't believe that's a good answer. I don't believe that answer. He said something to the effect of, well, this was an independent board, the independent committee that appointed me. It was basically tried to make it like this was some kind of groundswell of grassroots support that got him in. I don't believe that. I think that essentially, there are sort of an independent process for getting the independent senators appointed. That's true. But the people appointed to the independent process are generally pretty, I'd say, globally, ideologically in line with where the liberals are at, which is why the types of people who get selected to the Senate under the liberal government tend not to be particularly radically ideologically offside with the liberal government.
It's a nonpartisan, non-political independent body with a remarkable track record of picking people whose politics is not that different than Justin Trudeau.
That's right. Now, I would say that I think that the Liberals deserve some credit for they're not necessarily making partisan appointments necessarily. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they are, but they're not necessarily making partisan appointments. But there's no real radical diversity of ideological positioning in terms of the people who happen to get appointed to the Senate under this system. And then Adler kind of tried to skirt that particular criticism by saying, well, I'm a conservative, and here you have a liberal party in using their independent process to select a conservative person to the Senate. I'm like, Adler hasn't really been a conservative for the last 10 years, and everyone kind of knows it. Sorry, Adler, I realize that you still believe in private property, good for you, but that doesn't, I don't think that he's been sort of culturally aligned with the Conservative Party for quite a long time now. and in fact has been sometimes in quite a vicious and borderline partisan critic of anyone who disagrees with what I would say would be pretty liberal views. I mean, to some extent, some of his Twitter stuff has been borderline TrueAnon stuff for the last long time. There is no way that Justin Trudeau would have appointed Charles Adler to the Senate unless Charles Adler's political alignment was close enough to the Liberals to make that make sense to them internally. So, I mean, either Charles is being disingenuous with that, or he's being unself-aware. And I think that that's a fair criticism. I mean, Charles responded to that in the Jesperson interview by saying, well, the only people who think that I'm not a conservative are like crazy right-wing anti-vaxxers and convoyists.
No.
And to some extent, there's some truth to that.
There's some truth to that.
There's some truth. He's definitely earned the ire of a lot of people who are pretty far off the side of the plate. But I would challenge Charles to find one conservative whom he doesn't believe is crazy, who would consider him a conservative at this point, or representative of a conservative ideological strain of thought. I don't think there is one. I mean, I think that I've been blocked by Charles Adler at this point. I'm not a crazy anti-vaxxer alt-right-winger unless you've bought into a particular ideological, very partisan positioning of me. Same thing with you, Matt. I think we're pretty sane, sensible, center-ish, center-right people, depending on the issue.
I'm not expecting the call for the Senate to come anytime soon.
I'm not expecting the call from the Senate to come anytime soon from the Liberal Party. Let's just put it that way. So I mean, I just, for me, a lot of what he's doing here, I think he's a really odd choice. Personally, I think that his positioning is really odd. And of course, now a lot of his old commentary, both on the Senate and some of his older shock jock commentary, is now starting to come back to haunt him. I believe it was the Manitoba First Nations Assembly put out a press release that was like, this is a bad choice. This guy's made racist comments in the past, in the 90s and things like that. I mean, one of the big problems about being a pundit or being a shock jock is that inevitably you're going to have a very large baggage of things you've said in the past that didn't age well, because that's the nature of the job, right?
Well,
and that's what he's going to struggle to deal with. But I didn't think that his response to a lot of these critiques or a lot of these observations was very compelling or good. I think it was pretty disappointing, frankly. I think there are probably lots and lots of people in Manitoba who would be a very good choice. And then, of course, there were a couple of people who openly criticized Adler, saying he's a bad choice. And his response to that was, "Oh, that guy's got a personal grudge against me because I criticized him in his run for mayor." It's like there's always a reason to denigrate the critic, right? There's always a reason to be like, well, that person's just a crazy anti-vaxxer. That person's just got a personal grudge. That was sort of the nature of his commentary. And I didn't find that to be very self-aware or impressive in terms of his answers. So, like, as I said, mostly the thing I just want to get across to the listeners of the Line podcast is that neither Matt or I are auditioning for one of these types of jobs, and we have real issues when we see other journalists make this jump, and this is kind of why. I don't think it's appropriate for journalists to be in the Senate. I think that that's a fundamental misunderstanding of our role in the informational ecosystem. Which is not to say that I personally am moral or good enough to turn down that role myself if it were to come.
Senator Gerson's going to regret this podcast.
Senator Gerson is really going to regret this podcast in about 30
or
years.
Ambassador Gerson.
Or Ambassador Gerson, yeah, in about 30 or 40 years, right? I mean, people change, people evolve in their views, but I hope that like 70-year-old Senator Gerson will have the self-awareness to point out, to be honest with herself about how much that decision is at odds with where I stand today.
So I'm going to, for the reasons I stated right at the outset, I'm going to be circumspect in the comments I make here. I don't want to criticize Charles personally. We were joking at the very start of the podcast about the personal icky factor. Anything I feel moved to say to Charles on this, I'm going to say to him directly. I feel like I would owe him. And for the record, all I have said to him so far is a quick personal note of congratulations. I left it at that.
Great.
Two things. First, the pushback he's been getting for some of his original, or not original, but previous comments in his radio career or his columnist career, I'm not sure where it came from, on Indigenous groups objecting to his nomination. purely as a 100% practical comment, nothing about Charles, nothing about the comments. You or I know that we would not get through a vetting process. And I don't know about you, but I've been approached by political parties before to scout me out for would I want to run, would I want to roll. And what I've always been able to say to them, because I try to be self-effacing about this, have a sense of humor. Like telling them, no, fuck off and die. Are you crazy? Seems a little on the nose. So I try to be more polite about it. And my response has always been, with good humor, I would not pass your vetting process. And it's not that I've got skeletons in my closet personally. I don't. I am a very boring middle-aged dad with no real scandal in my past. But I've written thousands of columns. I remember maybe 3% of them. I probably don't agree with everything I've previously written. I would not be able to answer accurately a vetting questionnaire. I wouldn't remember.
Well, and the other problem is like
I would never pass.
And someone will inevitably take one line in one column out of context, and they'll try and kill you with it. And we know that because they do that to us all the time, right? Like this is the game now.
And I'm in a career where I don't have to give a shit that much.
That's
right. A little bit. I'm not going to trade for a job where I have to care a lot. So no, thank you. To the bigger issue of Charles and his politics, I want to make the comment that roughly 30 to 35% of the Canadian population on any given day is conservative, ideologically conservative, or has partisan support for the Conservative Party. And I have not done this, but I would be willing to lay down $5. I'm going to splurge. I would be willing to make a $5 wager that if we were to look at the candidates generated by the Trudeau government's independent senator selection process, we would probably find that less than 30 to 35% of that group would be regular conservative voters. And I'm not convinced that anyone would really seriously want to argue that point with me. And again, we'd have to go poll everybody, and I know that would be logistically awkward. I haven't done the legwork on this. This is a hunch. But my hunch is that the Senate appointment process has probably generated potential senators, I guess, at a rate that is not in alignment with Canadian electoral norms.
Which, by the way, I think is fine. I think it's completely fine for the Liberal government,
prime minister,
for a Liberal prime minister to appoint center left prime minister, senators. Because that's part of the game. You win, you won, you get to do that. But then I don't want to operate under a false delusion that the people that they're appointing aren't center left. That they are. Moving on.
Well, look, to Charles or to anyone else, let us, in a spirit of generosity, let us take what Charles has said at face value and say that a Liberal prime minister has appointed a conservative into the Senate. My question would then be to Charles or anyone else who would make a similar argument, who is the next most conservative person that that this Liberal prime minister has appointed in the Senate? Let's get a little short list going. And then let's let the public have their say with this. One thing I will say, and I can say this with a little bit more freedom and a little less circumspection, because this is something Charles and I had actually spoken about on one of his podcasts. So this is publicly available. You can go YouTube it. He had told me, and he said it live, that he feels that he hasn't changed in his politics and that the Conservative Party has left him by changing. And I say that's fine.
Sure.
Okay. No problem. I have often felt the same way.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have been quite critical of the Conservative Party on a lot of stuff that they've done of late. We don't agree with it either, but we're not partisans, so we don't have to.
I have never been partisan except for joining the Canadian Alliance Party in high school as part of a civics project. I was a member of the Canadian Alliance Party for 1 year.
So nerdy.
I got an A+ on my essay about joining a political party and voting in a leadership race. That is the extent of my partisan experience. I got so many calls from the Conservative fundraising list, I eventually told them that I was Matt Gurney's father and that Matt Gurney was dead. Then they stopped calling. I am a nonpartisan person who 10 years ago in my personal politics would have fit very comfortably inside the Conservative Party of Canada. I am a nonpartisan person who is obviously, I think people know, right-wing, who would not fit neatly inside the Conservative Party in Canada today. So I do understand what Charles is saying, but there is a difference, and I think you've made this point already, between your personal ideological beliefs and your partisan expressions. And what I would say to Charles, and I would say with respect and love, is that if someone was incapable of peering into his soul and were to judge him based on his public comments, especially those on Twitter, I do not believe they would come to the conclusion that he was a conservative. And I think we have to be mature as adults and recognize the fact that the statements that one makes on platforms such as Twitter, particularly when one has the moral authority of saying, hey, I'm a call from inside the house, a conservative taking on the Conservative Party. I am going to suggest, and again, in the spirit of mature adult conversation, that we would probably agree that the value that the Senate appointments process and the Prime Minister would eventually put on approving that appointment, the value they would assign to those comments is probably greater than zero. And we can talk about how much value it is, but I'm going to say it is greater than zero.
I'll be less circumspect. There's a great career to be made in Canadian media by being a token conservative.
You and I benefited from that.
There's a fantastic career to be made doing the rounds of, I mean, let's be honest, most of the media not all of it, but most of the media in Canada tends to skew center left around that kind of, soft liberal edge.
Someone's going to send you the editorial endorsement meme to you.
Yeah. There's a great career. I mean, I've been accused of this myself, but there's a great career to be made of like, well, I was a conservative back under Harper, under Preston, under blah, 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 but I've changed my ways. And trust me, you will get every single phone call from every single editor from every single one of those organizations, all of a sudden lapping your words up. There's nothing these people love more than a convert. And I would say that this probably the same is true on the other side. Like there's nothing that conservative media
criticizes Trudeau A1.
I'm just thinking just off the top of my head, take the Dave Rubin show, for example. Part of what made him so appealing to the conservative and quasi-conservative ecosystem is that he came from like the Young Turks. He came from the far left and had this like come to Jesus conversion moment. Yep. People freaking love a convert. And you can make a great brand and a great appeal for yourself by saying former Harper staffer or former whatever Preston Manning or former Mulrooney staffer comes to Jesus and realizes that the Liberals or the NDP actually have it right on contentious policy X. Like that is an absolute go-to brand building exercise. And I mean, it's something that I think I've been cautious of. I've been trying to really avoid becoming the token conservative or the acceptable conservative. I just try to be myself, and people like that or don't.
I'm a TVO columnist and a Toronto Star columnist.
Exactly.
I have a pretty realistic impression of what people view my role in those organizations as being. And I don't even mean my editors, but I mean the public.
No, it's like to some extent, there's a way to do that. That's responsible and honest, and just by saying, look, I'll work for anyone, but I'm going to be honest and tell you what I honestly think. That's honest, and I think that there are some people who lean into that particular kind of counterbranding as specifically as a counterbranding exercise. So, I mean, take it or leave it as it is. But I don't know. It's always been something that I think you and I have observed, and it's a bit of a shtick. And, but then at the same time, people do change their minds, right? I don't think all of this shtick is necessarily rooted in falsity or deception. I do think people do have different changes of alignment. I do think people have changes of ideological positioning. I think people go through personal things in their lives that change their perspective on the world, and that can be very honest and very legitimate. So long as we're being honest about it, right? Yeah.
Like and subscribe.
This episode of The Line has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada, which is dedicated to helping Canadians who are looking to quit smoking understand the full range of options available. Despite decades of government programs and regulations, today nearly 5 million Canadian adults smoke cigarettes. Adult smokers who choose to continue to smoke should be aware that other options exist. Right now, accessing information about these options is heavily restricted in Canada. While not risk-free, alternatives such as heated tobacco and vaping products provide a potentially less harmful choice than cigarettes. Cigarettes burn tobacco, resulting in smoke that contains 6,000 harmful chemicals that are associated with smoking-related disease and death. Heating tobacco and vaping products have the potential to significantly reduce this risk. Health agencies around the world are now considering these alternatives to help end smoking. Updated laws can help adult smokers better understand the full range of options available, including the relative risk of these products. Millions of Canadians smoke cigarettes. Technology exists that can help change that, but policymakers need to take action. Learn about how a smoke-free future can be achieved at unsmoke.ca.
Well, Jen's already gone full TMI on explaining why we're doing this podcast a day early, recording it later on Thursday instead of early on Friday, so that she can take a family trip to celebrate her personal circumstances, which I dare not repeat. But the day that we are recording this, Thursday the 22nd, is the first day of the rail lockout. All train service, cargo train service in Canada shut down. And this is interesting. This one was a curveball for me. I didn't know to expect this. Commuter rail services in the Greater Toronto area is disrupted as well, including GO Transit, which is a huge part of our transit system here. It moves tons of people. And they use CN or CP tracks in some segments. So some of their lines are shut down. I don't have any particular political comments or analysis to make. People are going to want to jump on Trudeau. They're going to want to say, oh, fuck Trudeau, it's his fault. Canada's broken, blah, blah, blah. I think there's an argument to be made that the federal government might have been slow to respond to this or might have not reacted quickly enough. I'm not convinced I'm sold on that argument, but I think you can make that argument in good faith. But I want to say right at the outset, I don't think this is Trudeau's fault. This is hard bargaining by two implacably opposed groups, and now we're in a situation where there's a work stoppage. I don't think we need to drag federal politics into this. Can I just make the point, though, that 5 or 6 years ago, about 6 years ago, I thought nothing about choo-choos.
Oh, lucky you. Trust me, I've been thinking a lot about choo-choo since my son hit about 18 months, and we have not been able to stop thinking about the choo-choos.
Not my situation here.
Mm-hmm.
2019, the Wet'suwet'en blockades. Mm-hmm. I sat down as, at the time, I was National Post columnist, and I sat down and I was like, I wonder how disruptive this is going to be. Because there was that one line in Ontario, I think it was, that was closed down. And I was hearing from some of my sources weird rumblings that this was a much bigger deal than I realized. And my own sense was, yeah, okay, it's a pain in the ass. It's going to be expensive. It's disruptive. I'm not sure it sets a great political precedent or policing precedent, but I wasn't that worried about it. But I was hearing weird rumbles. So I said to one of my editors, give me like a day off from normal work and let me go talk to some experts in logistics and supply chains and things like that. And what I ended up writing an article for it where, having spoken to all these actual experts in this, as a guy who had no prior knowledge or interest in rail logistics, realizing how utterly dependent North America is on rail logistics. Now, I think the broader public thinks that trains were this cool thing we had in the 19th century, but then we all had cars and trucks and superhighways and expressways and freeways and driveways and garages. An enormous percentage of North American trade, for at least part of its journey, still travels on rail. Rail in agriculture, it's massive. In petrochemicals and chemicals and fertilizers, which overlaps a bit with agriculture, it's massive. For dry bulk goods, it's massive. It is late summer in Canada. The crops are getting harvested soon. We can't move this shit by truck. There is not enough roads, there's not enough trucks, and there's not enough truck drivers to replace rail. And that 2019 Wet'suwet'en blockade column that I wrote, where I basically discovered how epically fucked Atlantic Canada was going to be, Because Atlantic Canada, the geography of Atlantic Canada is weird. Small population, hugely distributed across an actually surprisingly large landmass. Atlantic Canada covers a lot of land, and it's dependent on like one road or a bunch of train tracks, and the trains weren't running. So a year later, COVID hits. It was in a weird way, I felt better prepared for COVID because in 2019, I had a personal family medical emergency that exposed me to the healthcare system, and I had the Wet'suwet'en blockade column. So I kind of went into COVID with a pretty up-to-date understanding on healthcare dysfunction and how dependent we were on supply chains. I don't think it's going to be a problem imminently because I think there's going to be enough inventoried parts in places to keep the essential stuff running for a while. But if this drags on for a long time, I think a lot of North Americans, mostly in Canada, but somewhere in the United States, because we're an integrated transit network, I think a lot of North Americans might get a crash course in how dependent we are on rail-based logistics, even in the 21st century.
Yeah,
don't sleepwalk through this one. This is actually a big deal.
It is a big deal, and also the actual terms and agreements between. I'm quite sympathetic to the strikers in this particular case. I happen to be, but that's a whole other side conversation. But I do think that the odds of this getting to be the difference between the Wet'suwet'en blockade is that essentially people were physically putting stuff on the tracks, making them unsafe for passage, and the only way to clear that was that you needed to have strong police action to go into potentially very dangerous and very contentious situations and physically clear the tracks. That was a unique sort of set of problems. This one is a strike is that worst case scenario, you can legislate people back to work. Whether or not they'll go back to work would be another issue, but
that's the next question.
You can use the power of the state in a very effective way here to force supply chains back online if supply chains are actually get to the point where they're seriously threatened. So
I mostly agree with that, but a couple of buts here. The Suez Canal gets a ship stuck in it, which was hilarious. Global trade needed weeks to respond. Not enough rain in Panama, so the Panama Canal shipping gets cut. We've had the Houthis using the Red Sea as a personal shooting gallery and a ship goes down, et cetera, et cetera. COVID being the best example. If we shut down the rails in Canada for a week, it might take us 6 months to recover from that disruption.
Yeah, but you know what? The actual lesson, I took the opposite lesson from all of those examples.
Things were more resilient than you think.
I thought that things were going to get really, really fucked during COVID, to the extent that I started growing potatoes in sacks in my little tiny, urban
We just harvested
patio.
Our sack potatoes, and they were delicious.
They were delicious, and it definitely is worth doing because it's a lot of fun, especially with kids. But let's be clear, I was not surviving through the winter on that shit. So I got a real crash course in
Our 2 sacks of potatoes generated one delicious, hearty side dish.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, that's what I'm saying here. I was not able to feed my family of 4 on my tiny 13 by 13 inch or 13 by 13 foot deck. So thank you, farmers of Canada. But on the whole, I thought things were going to get real pear-shaped real fast, and they kind of did in a lot of ways, but they didn't go as pear-shaped as I thought they were. Like, we weren't starving. Right now, we're kind of starving now because all of the cost of the groceries has gone up. But
different issue.
We're not starving, right? And yes, food availability is more stressed now than it was prior to COVID. But that's not really as a result of the failure or a collapse of the logistics chains. So I'm actually quite optimistic going in on some of the logistics stuff. I think you're right. I think that this is a big deal, and this is something that we need to be paying attention to. And yes, even small disruptions in a logistics chain can have weird branching network effects. So it's something to pay attention to, particularly considering we're already stressed on grocery bills, right? But I'm not freaking out on this one either.
One of my most interesting takeaways from COVID, very, very early in COVID, like the first days, I made a bunch of calls because I still had those guys in my Rolodex from the Wet'suwet'en column. And I started just calling rail logistics guys. And one of the things they told me is that if we lose Kansas City to a big outbreak, you should flee the cities because Kansas City is like a rail node for all of North America.
Oh, well, thanks for saying that publicly, Matt.
I waited 5 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, who the hell knows listening to our podcast now? Jesus Christ.
Like and subscribe, Al
Like
Qaeda.
like and subscribe.
But
Oh, we're gonna
one of
get
the other
on and
things,
watch this.
yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure we're huge in the terrorism community. Huge listenership coming from them. What I would say, one of the interesting conversations I had, the rail guys had told me, I think we can do this. They said rail work is fairly solitary. Guys at the yards are, and the interchanges are outside and they're physically distributed. Trains, you can bubble them or operate on very limited crews. So they weren't too worried, but they said, we don't know about our customers. Like, and one of the rail guys had said to me, where do our agriculture guys, like the entire agriculture sector, where do they get their fertilizers? I'm like, I don't know. So I called them. Like, I called up a bunch of the ag associations. I mean, where do you get your fertilizers? And they told me, I don't know. I was like, what do you mean you know? You are the agricultural sector. They're like, yeah, we just order this shit. Like, we go online and we're like, we need like X quantity of whatever. And then it shows up. And I'm like, does it come from China? Does it come from Africa? Does it come from Europe? Does it come from Sarnia? And they said, we don't know. We got to figure this out. I ended up finally working my way up through the food chain, no pun intended, to a guy who is sort of one of the defining experts in like North American agriculture logistics. And I had this quick phone call with him because he was totally slammed. Never spoken to him before, never spoken to him since. I was lucky to get him on the phone. One of the things he told me was his snap prediction. And this was like the first 2 weeks of the pandemic. He goes, there's actually a lot of resiliency in these systems already. They're more resilient than you think. So he goes, my bet is 70% chance everything's fine. That there's going to be some awkwardness. We're going to have to relearn to do a few things, but everything's going to be fine. He goes, there's a 20% chance that there's going to be significant food shortages in North America, but there's not going to be a calorie deficit. He goes, certain things might be just not available on the shelves, but everybody's going to have enough to eat because there'll be enough of something else. He says, North America generates so much food that we, if we all lose 10% of our calories, we're all going to live longer for it.
Yeah.
He said, there's a 10% chance the food supply is going to collapse catastrophically rapidly. Here he goes, I don't know yet what it's going to be, but he goes 70%, no problem. 20% significant disruptions, 10% civilization as we know it is over. We landed in that 20%.
I also don't like the fact that our odds were as close high as 10. I don't like 10 as like civilization, existential collapse being the odd. 10%'s too high for that for me.
Dude, I don't know what it was like in Calgary, but in Toronto, we had the you couldn't get lettuce.
Yeah, like limes. For some reason, I remember we couldn't get limes for a while. It was just weird.
Canned soup.
Yeah.
Like, so we actually
there was really bad. So there's a diaper formula. Remember that? Yeah. Formula, yeah. That was scary.
So there were 3 brackets this guy gave me, one of which was end of life as we know it, and we landed at the one just under that one. So
we landed at the can't get limes.
Or lettuce. I try to remember what the shortages were, but I remember I just really wanted to eat some soup because I like soup, and I couldn't. There was no, you could make soup, I guess, and it was probably 2 years before you could again reliably find everything in the grocery store that you were used to.
Mm-hmm. And at 4 times the cost?
Yeah.
Like and subscribe the 9.
And subscribe. Are you ready, Jennifer Gerson? Married woman now of 10 years. Sorry, length of marriage, not of age.
Yeah. That would be uncomfortable.
Very much so. Are you ready for a vibe check?
Vibes. Vibe me.
This is based on something that was announced in Ontario this week.
Okay.
So I'm going to go full Ontario on you for a couple minutes.
I can tolerate it.
Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, greatest province in the Federation.
The finest premier, and by
the
fine
finest
I mean
premier of the finest province.
Yeah, and by fine I mean
he'll be fine.
He'll be fine. He's been fine.
I got the joke, Jen. We don't need to do your trauma now.
No trauma dumping on the podcast.
Oh no, lots of trauma dumping. We're just not doing that particular trauma today.
All right, fine.
He made some announcements this week. Ontario is going to change its regulations around, and I might mangle the exact verbiage, but the supervised consumption sites for drugs.
Okay.
He is changing the regulations. He's not banning them, but he's changing the regulations to introduce a 200-meter bubble around schools.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to have the effect of shutting down a series of ones that already exist.
Mm-hmm.
And the government has said it is going to not authorize any further supervised safe consumption sites. It has also said that it is going to begin staffing up a series of hubs for addictions treatment and therapy.
So very obviously what this really means is that Doug Ford hates addicts and wants them to die en masse.
Yeah.
Right.
I have not spent enough time, and this is the segment 1, we couldn't remember Triple E's Senate, and here I am I'm going to totally redeem my journalistic reputation here. I haven't read any of the details of this yet, so I'm going to offer no particular commentary on the specifics of this proposal.
Okay.
But do you remember a few months ago when we were talking on this very podcast, and we were talking then about, it was Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta, the second greatest province of this federation, where she was weighing in on top surgery for minors.
It sounds like legislation in Alberta. Legislation for this is actually expected to come down the pipe for the fall.
And things like sports bodies regulating themselves on who competes under what gender. You and I had a conversation then about the pendulum swinging.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I had talked about at the time, because I yielded the floor to you for most of that conversation because you gave me the view from Alberta, but I had made the opinion that whether it was in Atlantic Canada or Alberta and now on the drug policy in Ontario, politicians are grabbing third rails that would have been instantaneously fatal 5 years ago.
Yep.
And they're not even getting a little zap.
Nope.
And it's such an interesting vibe check moment because I actually support harm reduction. Now, I think the way we've done it is stupid, but on an intellectual way, I get the argument of getting people who are incurably, desperately lost in addiction is probably a multi-step process. First, you prevent them from dying of tainted drugs, and then you prevent them from dying of overdoses, and then you get them into stable housing. So I understand why harm reduction is an important part of that. But I will never understand, and you've made the joke already, how so many of our leading lights of progressivism in North America decided that they didn't have to win the arguments about these things, that it was acceptable to just go, if you are not in favor of this, you want addicts to die in alleys. Right. You are a bad person. If you think there's anything weird about having someone who was born male but now identifies as female, and I gave you this example when we were talking about it a few months ago in my own social group, hearing a bunch of upper middle class centrist Torontonians become radicalized on this after a soccer game at a tournament where a biological male competing as a female injured a series of girls. And the response among some was, you're a bigot who wants trans people to commit suicide. People have been radicalized by the inability for us to have conversations that accept the evidence before our eyes. At our line event in Toronto, pardon me?
That's a good way of putting it.
At our first ever big line event in Toronto, almost a year ago, we talked about the specific issue in Leslieville, a community where there was one of these sites.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting to me is I said to you in the first segment talking about Charles Adler's tweets, I said a reasonable person probably would assign a greater than 0 assessment of those tweets as part of why he was elected to this. I'm going to use very similar language here. I think it was an error for many probably well-meaning activists and advocates of people with mental health issues or addiction issues to assign a value of 0 to community opposition and community complaints. But that seems to me what happened.
Okay, so couple of points here, and I will follow on this idea. I'm going to riff on this idea. One, I'm not necessarily inherently opposed to harm reduction in all cases, but I don't think that there's a silver bullet to the problem of drug addiction. I think that drug addiction is incredibly complicated. I don't think that we should be making decisions about how we deal with that based on any kind of ideology. We should, in a perfect world, be making decisions on that based entirely on credible, non-interested, dispassionate science. And that means dispassionate science that isn't just run by activists who have one particular agenda that they're trying to put forward one way or the other. Okay? I realize that that is a perfect world that we do not live in. That's fine.
You
but
dreamer, you.
I my dreamer me. But a harm reduction policy, for example, that it says, look, if you are incurably addicted to drugs, and you can only operate by, injecting or taking opioids once or twice a day, I don't actually have a problem with that person getting a safe supply of drugs, so long as it's done in a supervised capacity. So maybe you're going to your local safe consumption site, you're getting your drugs from a trusted source, and you have to consume them on site. I think that the problem is when you bring those drugs into the community, you're now flooding the community with opioids, and we're starting to see the knock-on effects of that. And the knock-on effects of that are incompatible with the stated goals of people who are into harm reduction, which is to reduce overdose deaths. We've seen overdose deaths continue to rise. And their response to that is, well, yeah, but the drugs are tainted. Like, okay. And deaths are continuing to rise. If you can continue to, if you have no metric for success, and you can explain away every single failure by simply not doing the existing policy hard enough, then the only answer is to continue to double and triple and quadruple down on the existing policy as it continues to fail.
Real communism has never been tried, Jen.
It's the real communism has never been tried problem. If you want to introduce a radical new policy to society, and harm reduction and safe supply are radical new policies, I'm not necessarily saying they're bad, but they're new and they're radical. You need to start by saying, this is what success looks like. This is how we know that we'll have succeeded. And more importantly, this is how we'll know when we failed. And right now we're coming to terms with the fact that we're starting to realize that these policies are failing, or at the very least, they're not succeeding in the way that we had hoped. Okay. So here's the other thing I would also notice is that a lot of the people who were very strong on safe supply and harm reduction were terrible at the very concept of genuine community buy-in. In order to get a safe supply or safe consumption site in a community, you need that community to accept and genuinely embrace that as a viable harm reduction policy. And not all communities are the same. And sometimes these things make sense in some communities and not others. If you're Vancouver downtown east side, a safe consumption site makes sense in a way that maybe doesn't make sense if you're Leslieville. Those are different communities with different expectations. And when I say you need to actually actively solicit and build community buy-in, that means part of that job is also making sure that the people in the community see you as an overall asset to the community.
Yeah, force for good.
And a force for good in the community. So you're helping the people there and maybe getting people off the streets, or maybe helping people integrate into the community in a healthy and harmonious way. The community around you can't see you as a problem, right? One of the things that I think a lot of harm reduction advocates have tried to bypass is the genuine community buy-in phase of this. And instead they've gone straight to, we're right, we're right, we have the science on our side, another conversation, we have the science on our side, and so forth. Therefore, we're going to bully anyone who disagrees with us into compliance. So we're going to call everybody who has an issue with us, with our approach philosophically, an evil, bigoted, right-wing, terrible, racist asshole who just wants to see addicts disappear or die off the streets. And anybody who has any actual opposition, we're going to basically shame them into silence and submission. And the problem with that is that it works for a while until it doesn't. Because it doesn't actually give you community consensus, it gives you false community consensus.
Worse than that, it turns your opponents into radicals.
Yeah, it radicalizes your opponents, and it creates a very temporary and fragile community consensus around a policy position.
And when that pendulum swings, it doesn't go back neutral.
But what do we mean when pendulum swings? What that means is when the fear of you breaks, you have nothing left. You have no leverage, right? Like it collapses instantly. And I would say, like, let's get into deep political theory here. Why is it that totalitarian regimes have proven themselves to be consistently less durable than liberal ones? People look at the messy, liberal, contentious, polarized, adversarial democracies like ours and say, this doesn't make any fucking sense. Why can't you all just come together and come with a decision? This is messy. This takes time. Those
regimes do not allow themselves the off-ramp of incremental change and orderly transition. It becomes a winner-takes-all will-to-power battle.
No, also, it's simpler than that. It's because the consensus that they build within their society is built on fear. And firstly, dissent is necessary to the creation of healthy and harmonious community sustainability in the long run. You need actual outlets for dissent and disagreement. You need actual outlets for argumentation and polarization to occur, and those need to be legitimate and seen as legitimate within the society. Because through that process of argumentation and disagreement, you actually wind up usually coming to some kind of durable, long-lasting compromise that can then withstand generations of challenge. Whereas in a totalitarian approach, which is fear-based or shame-based, you can build the appearance of total unity within a society that lasts right up to the moment when the fear and shame apparatus collapses. And then it's gone. Just gone. And we've seen kind of like a little miniature version of that play out, because I think you and I both acknowledge that we think that, for lack of a better term, woke, and I understand that it's a controversial term, woke, but understand we all know what we're talking about here. The woke consensus was...
It's peaked.
It peaked in 2020. Yeah. It started to turn in 2020, and it was well underway by 2022. And now we're just seeing where the bottom hits, right? Like that's
George Floyd riots, I think, was peak.
Yeah, I think that's about right. That was the moment, and everything there has been a retrenchment, and now we're into what's reactionary. We're now starting to see when we're going to end the nadir, and we're going to get into reactionary backlash, right? So, and I don't know how far the pendulum goes in the opposite radical direction. You can probably be assured that when it starts to go into a really, really crazy place, you and I are going to start bitching about that one too. But the end result of this is just like, I think the lesson that we have to learn as a society is that you can't build durable consensus by shutting your opponents down.
Yeah,
that does not work. It's like, aside from the morality of all of it, aside from it's the incompatibility of that position with a liberal society, it does not work. It is not an effective way. You'll get 2-3 years out of that, maybe 5. And then when the pendulum turns on you, it's going to turn hard, fast, and irrecoverable. So that's what we're starting to see.
I think you make it worse on yourself. I think you trade short-term appearance of maximum success, but the trade-off, that what you trade for that is you end up being reset further when the pendulum swings.
Yeah.
Because the enduring consensus is probably not to everyone's liking, but it would be nibbled at incrementally, as opposed to, well, actually, we're shutting the fucking thing down now, and
like
you're back
tomorrow,
to zero.
Goodbye. Moving on.
And the bigger vibe part of this for me is, I think you're right in your political analysis and your messaging analysis, but I also just think, I looked at, and I'll send our producer some screen caps. I will so we can overlay them when I'm talking right now. Just have to put a mental note to remember to do that. But I was looking at Ontario's public health data portal for opioids, and they're not good. ER admissions, the line ain't quite vertical, but it's awfully steep. Deaths pretty steep too. You'll notice a downtick at the very end of the graph there. The data for 2022 is incomplete, and that's so the last full year is 2021, and I'm sure there's pandemic disruptions as well. But I was just thinking in the big picture sense, and what are the issues we talk about in the broader context of talking about these issues? We talk about homelessness, we talk about crime, we talk about public safety, health. We talk about obvious key metrics like opioid hospitalizations or opioid deaths. And all of these are bad. And you had written a column, I guess it was about a year ago now. I don't remember exactly when. It was
about the Vancouver East Side, yeah.
Pardon me?
It was about the Vancouver downtown East Side.
Where, and I'm echoing your conclusions then. I would like someone to explain to me what success would be and what failure would be, so that we can then assess the effectiveness of what we are doing and use accountability mechanisms to correct course if needed.
Radical thought. Radical thought.
So right now, and again, like this is like the fun stuff that goes on in my brain. 10% chance of total collapse of food supply. And this next thought. One of the arguments that you and I is going to be made, and it may well be true, is that yes, crime is up, homelessness is up, public disorder is up, overdose deaths are up, opioid overdoses, non-fatal are up. But without these sites, it would be worse. Okay.
Sure.
Could be.
Could be.
But are we then adopting as a matter of public policy belief and recognition that this G7 country and its 41 million people and $2 trillion economy are only capable of slowing down the enshittification? Like, is that actually our position here? Yes, things are getting worse, but they would be worse otherwise, and that's the best we can do. Or are there things we could be doing that would maybe flatline this stuff, or even maybe bring it down? I don't know when we're going to have these conversations, but I have the feeling, looking at our politics, and this is why I've called this whole segment a vibe check, that instead of reasonable centrist moderates being like, well, let's have a technocratic approach and get some metrics and track some stuff and make adjustments.
Yeah, we're real sexy, let me tell you.
It's going to be the populists who go, are you tired of needles in your park? Vote for me and fuck the addicts.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's where Poilievre is now. And I don't think that's where Ford is now, even though I think his critics will say that's where he is. But if this doesn't get better in 5 years, was it the Philippines that was
worst?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to remember. Was it the Philippines where they were just randomly executing all the drug dealers?
No, but wasn't it,
like
Venezuela?
That seemed weird 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Where do we end up on this? Because I can tell you, Jen, the population's radicalizing.
Very quickly. And like, here's the thing, like, if you want to talk about a set of policies that probably would make sense to me from where I'm standing right now, and I mean, this could change, I think it's going to be a combination of things that are unpopular to both the left and the right. So I think it's going to be a combination
harm reduction and forced treatment.
Yeah. It's going to be harm reduction, radical expansion of voluntary treatment, and in certain cases, forced treatment.
What if that doesn't work? Think 5 years out.
Then a lot of people are going to die.
I was reading just this morning in the Waterloo Record. It's a Torstar company paper in Waterloo, Ontario, about a woman who wrote an op-ed who lives in the GTA, and tell me, like, this same old story, right? Their car got stolen from their driveway, and they had a GPS tracker in it, and she and her husband, or father-in-law or something, they got the truck back. Like, they just went to where it was. And they said, okay, well, they called the cops. They made the report. The cops didn't give a shit. So they said, okay, then they got it back here. And the woman was writing in the article, talking about, is this really what we want? This is soft vigilantism. The next step up from soft vigilantism is hard vigilantism.
Okay, so Matt, let's play with this idea a little bit, because I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Okay. Maybe the problem here is that your and my expectations are a problem.
Yeah.
And the idea that we're expecting society to look like it did 10 years ago isn't realistic. Maybe the problem here is that we have negative views toward drug use. And maybe the problem is, again, I'm playing devil's advocate here. Maybe the problem is that we just need to accept that there are going to be certain segments of the population who want to be on drugs and are going to be on drugs indefinitely. And that's fine. And homelessness, homeless encampments, open drug use, that kind of thing is just the norm that we have to accept and get used to.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's just what it is. Maybe the idea that I should be able to walk down the street with my kid and not see people smoking crack or doing heroin in front of me on the streets, or I should not be seeing people physically dying in front of me on the streets. Maybe that's not a realistic expectation. Maybe that's just the norm now, and we just have to accept that norm and just say that this is the way people are choosing to live their lives, and hey, there's maybe some options for them to get off the street if they choose to take advantage of that. And if that's not the way they want to live their lives, my maximalist sort of quasi-libertarian philosophy requires that I accept their lifestyle choices as valid and legitimate, and that they've got every right to as I said, set up camps and parks and engage in whatever behavior that they wish to engage in. And that's just the new norm for us here. What do we do if that's the standard?
You have just laid out the most plausible, direct Canadian path into fascism.
Okay, why? Why would you not just say, you Canadians, your expectations of a peaceful, orderly society, downtown society are unrealistic, and people are going to do drugs, and you have a problem. If you have a problem with that, you are the problem.
You can absolutely say that. You're just not
Okay.
going to convince enough people.
Okay, so then what are they going to do? What are you going to do?
Well, like I said, we're already at the soft vigilantism stage.
So what, you think people are going to go around and put drug addicts in the back of trucks and disappear them? Like,
It's happened in other places. I think Canadians are pretty polite people. I think we are conditioned in a way that is maybe to our detriment in some ways, but in this way, very much to our betterment. We are not impulsive as a people, which is itself a Canadian understatement. But I'm telling you, and I don't know if this is apparent in Calgary as it may be in parts of Toronto, people are looking at each other funny. One of the things I've mentioned to you before, and I've said this on and off the podcast, is a couple of years ago, if you wanted to get a firearms license, you'd go on the website, the next class would be on Tuesday, and it would be half enrolled. People I know who've been getting their gun license in Toronto have had to wait months for an available spot in class. I've mentioned these before in a different context. There's a gun store in York Region where I buy some parts from, and I needed a part for a shotgun. Just broke, and I needed a part. And I went there and I looked around the store and it was empty. It was not empty of customers. The inventory was low. And I said to the guy, "What's going on?" Because I'm not a regular there, but he knows me by now. And I'm like, "What's going on?" And he goes, "I can't keep stuff on the shelves." So right now we're already at the soft vigilantes stage where there are already private security forces supplementing law enforcement in Toronto, a couple of neighborhoods. And this is not crazy stuff. This is stuff that's been publicly reported in the media.
Yeah.
Certain neighborhoods, particularly wealthier neighborhoods, are banding together to hire private security to supplement local Toronto or 905 police forces. I don't have the stats on this yet because they're not released quickly enough. But anecdotally, I am confident the number of Torontonians or Canadians generally who are armed is going up, or at least who are getting their licenses is going up. There's an increasing number of stories, again, in the press of the police are asking you to stop using the GPS and going and get your car back because you could be putting yourself into danger. Bollards, the traffic obstacles, retractable bollards are now sold at Costco so that people can put them on their driveways so that their cars don't get stolen. A fairly routine conversation. It's not exactly water cooler stuff, but an issue that has come up organically in some of my conversations in the last 6 months are people retrofitting their houses with barred windows, security cameras, front doors that are resistant to being kicked open. I wrote that column for us a few months ago about how the police had surrendered. Human history tells us how people respond when community safety or public safety in their communities goes down. It is not with Gerson-esque libertarian acceptance.
well, we'll find out now, won't we? Because I don't think we're solving any of these problems.
I'm not predicting dystopia. I think it would take something pretty catastrophic to get the Canadian public off the couch and into an armed revolt.
Yeah,
but I'm pretty confident.
The twisted thing is you look at what's happened to Britain, right? And you look at the riots in Britain over the 3 girls who got stabbed. And I mean, we've talked about that in previous podcasts. That was based in misinformation. But like, you throw a spark on a tinderbox, right? Like, are we a tinderbox?
You never know until you throw the spark.
You never know until you throw the spark, right?
But I think Look, this is, I'm not going to make this a prediction because who the fuck knows? Life is
Who the fuck
complicated.
knows? Yeah.
But one of the worries I have is where this will boil over is some guy is either going to, his Jeep or his Land Rover, his Bronco or whatever has been stolen twice already. His insurance premiums have doubled. He's pissed off. The same two underage car thieves who keep boosting the cars and handing them over to the gangs come back, and the guy steps out of his house with a shotgun and he kills one of them. The other possibility is that guy puts a GPS tracker on his car, goes to the warehouse where the car has been taken before it gets put on a car and shipped out of the country, and they kill him.
Yeah.
I don't know what happens the day after that. And as a Canadian pundit, columnist, journalist, observer, whatever you want to call me, one of my little rules is that in Canada, the least exciting outcome is probable. Other countries, I think the more, in any situation, you can probably expect the worst possible outcome. In Canada, I think normally the least interesting outcome is the likely one. But I think to your point, like expectations being a problem, I got expectations that are problems, no doubt, but I don't expect this to get better. And it's getting harder and harder to tell random normal people I talk to that their communities are as safe as they were 10 years ago, that their transit ride, like I was just 3 days ago talking to a friend, a woman, Jen, she is 5 foot nothing. And she was telling me, I was just having a pleasant chat. I was like, hey, nice bike. Because she was riding around the bike in the neighborhood. I'm like, I haven't seen it on the bike before. She's like, oh, it's new. I just got a bike. I'm like, that's great. And she goes, yeah, I won't ride the TTC anymore. It's too scary. This woman has calculated that riding a fucking bicycle in the streets of Toronto is less dangerous than the TTC.
Yeah. That seems like a problem.
People will want to argue with me on a stats basis, right? People are going to show me charts that things are going down. I don't necessarily dispute that. I would suggest right now that there are massive underreporting of certain crimes. The public has gotten the message. The cops don't give a shit. I was punched by a weirdo on the TTC. He didn't do any damage to me. He just kind of clipped me a little bit. I never filed a report. I went out and got a hot dog.
Yeah.
So like, and I think that there's a lot of that going on, but also perception matters. And like we were saying a few minutes ago, you can't scream at Doug Ford what you want addicts to die. You can't tell a guy who's convinced that his neighborhood's less safe because his neighbor had the door kicked in and the valuables stolen. You can't show that guy a chart.
Also, I'm sorry, but like last time I went to Toronto, I ran into issues on the TTC twice. So how in the world is and that's not. I went to school in Toronto back in the early 2000s. That didn't happen, and yet every time I go to Toronto now and ride the TTC, I see problems.
All of my weirdest.
I can't reconcile that with your charts.
All of my weirdest TTC experiences have been in the last 2 years.
Yeah, bizarre.
I mean, at least 4 of the top 5. The 5th was being stuck on a Yonge Street bus because the subways were closed, having to go from downtown all the way up to Finch Station with a guy who insisted my friends and I sing every Billy Joel song we knew the lyrics to.
Well, that's just fun.
We did. We had a great time.
Yeah, come on now. That's not even... It's a beautiful mosaic of living in a city. Anyway, on that note, I do think...
in the middle of the singing.
Oh. Well...
We just kept right on going with For the Longest Time. We didn't miss a beat.
That's living your best life. On that note, like and subscribe to Line. I think we should put a pin on it there. We've been rambling for some time, but I think we've had a good conversation. Thank you.
I feel better for it. I'm sure
I feel better. I feel like we've got a lot off our chest here. Mm-hmm. All right. Yep. On that note, come check us out, www.readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe. Please do see us. And I think we're going to be going back to a full-time schedule in about 2 weeks. So
yeah, I think so. When Labor Day is early this year.
Labor Day is a little early this year. So
what? Probably my guess, and we'll talk about this more. My guess is the Monday, 2 weeks from now will probably be the end of the summer schedule. The Monday after that, we're probably back in business. Yeah.
All right. Cool. All right. On that note, if you have anything to pitch us, also send us a note.
Because we're
Because
need content
we're like
again.
we're a little short of content. So send us a note. Cheers. Thanks again.
Today's podcast was brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Now is the time to modernize Canadian laws so that adult smokers have information and access to better alternatives. By doing so, we can create lasting change. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.